Welcome to the Industry Experts Panel at PortfolioWealthGlobal.com. My name is Michelle Holliday. Today's show is going to be a history lesson for all of us and a warning about the future, because today we are welcoming Mr. Wayne Jett. Wayne's professional background as an attorney for over 30 years placed him in cases at the state, federal, and appellate courts, including the United States Supreme Court. And since 2000, Wayne has been speaking widely on constitutional law and financial system failures. He is the managing principal at classicalcapital.com and the author of the book, The Fruits of Graft: Great Depressions Then and Now. We have published a free report which highlights Wayne's work to supplement this interview. The link is at portfoliowealthglobal.com/Wayne. And now it is my privilege to welcome to the show Mr. Wayne Jett. Thank you so much for being here, sir. How are you today?
Very well, Michelle, and it's a pleasure. The honor's mine, and thank you for having me.
We are so honored to have you on this show. Wayne, we want to start off right off the top with our financial system. Most people know that we are in trouble right now and that we have been manipulated into this position. It's very interesting that this has been intentionally created over many generations and that it has all been done in secret. In April of 1961, President John F. Kennedy gave a speech about the danger of secrecy within a society. And one of the interesting things about the speech is that it was given to a group of investigative journalists, the American Newspaper Publishers Association, to lay the groundwork for everyone, Wayne, to understand these secret societies and what is happening today. Take us back to the Great Depression and talk to us about the facts and the people surrounding the way that it was actually orchestrated.
Well, thank you for asking me that. It certainly is a subject of great importance today because the people of the United States, including myself and my entire life, we've been told that the U.S. government did all it possibly could to defeat the Great Depression, to roll it back, to end it, to care for the people who were suffering so badly, the ones who were not just suffering but were starving to death. That's what we've been told. We've been told about the New Deal and how compassionate it was and so forth. I have to tell you that my research about what was done to cause the Great Depression, I'm convinced that it was done absolutely purposely with pre-planning. There is more than one proof of that, but in any event, it was a very cruel set of actions that actually imposed the Great Depression and made sure that it continued, and frankly, that it starved to death as many Americans as possible, as well as others around the world. But the history is that the Great Depression was the worst in the U.S. as compared to other countries. And of course, that was because the U.S. was a major target of it, because it was such an engine of the middle class at that time. I want to make sure that people understand the middle class is not just middle income people. It's all people capable of supporting themselves economically. That's the middle class that had come up in the middle between the slaves and the ruling class that had existed for centuries as the only two classes in society. Once the ideas of classical economics began to develop around the 18th century, 1750 and so forth, with the books by Adam Smith, the ideas started to develop that there were ways in which individuals could be more prosperous if they were just given a chance and they could support themselves. And those ideas finally got some support in the parliament, the elected parliament of England and Great Britain. And with that help, commoners the ones who were never anything other than the serfs up to that time, but they kept fighting for the political rights. And they finally were able to get a toehold in the parliament, to get a parliament in the first place, and then a toehold with influence. And what became known as the theory of the firm came to be persuasive in the thinking of legislators. The theory of the firm was what rules and policies will allow ordinary people their best chance to make a living, to actually become prosperous. And it was those ideas that began in Europe, began in well, and in large part, it also began in America, really, from people who had fled from Europe because it was so bad there, that there simply wasn't enough opportunity. So they came out to a place where there weren't enough laws to keep them from supporting themselves, and enough oppression. So it was America that was really the foothold for what became called capitalism, that is, doing the best you can to support yourself and to be as prosperous as you can be. But again, in the society of old in Europe, the social system, the economic system, was called mercantilism. That was a very polite name given to the subject by academicians, because academicians who gave it an impolite name would quickly be dispatched. That is, hanged or worse, or something of the sort. So mercantilism became the subject that I was taught about in my history lessons when I was a boy in the 1950s. Most people today say they've never heard of it before, but let me tell you, in my considered opinion, the American system, economic system, is most clearly mercantilism today. We are not capitalists. The capitalism in our society has almost entirely been overrun by the mercantilists who run Wall Street, who run the Federal Reserve, who run our federal government, who control every person who gets into high office, almost, whether they know it or not. The mercantilists rule from a secret network that eventually they had the audacity to have it published in writing in 1901 as their manifesto, what I call it, a little book that got no attention in the public, but it certainly got attention in the halls of power. Its author had been unknown. He was a Britisher, not even an American. Most likely, well, he was raised in a poor environment as a commoner, but he must have been, we'll say, an illegitimate son of a royal or something of the sort, because he had access to higher education in Britain. And then he became a science fiction writer, as well as horror stories, books and so forth. Had about a dozen or so, but was not well known. But then all of a sudden he was invited to the White House of Theodore Roosevelt as the honored guest on the arm of academicians of the East Coast, including Margaret Sanger. And why was he honored as a guest at the White House of Theodore Roosevelt? Because of this little book he had written, in which the second 2/3 of the book is the manifesto for the ruling elite, expressing very clearly in straightforward terms, not nuanced, but directly stating that the ruling class is fed up with the great gray mass called democracy, giving the idea to more and more people that they had the right to vote and express political views about how they were governed, that had to be wiped out entirely, and that the middle class itself, all those able to support themselves, must be wiped out without a trace, and it must be done promptly, or else the ruling class would never be able to get back to what it wanted to do, that is, rule with only a ruling class and a limited number of slaves for their servants. That was the book called Anticipations by It's got a much longer name, Anticipations of the Reactions of Society to Mechanization and Technology, or something of that sort. Something that's off-putting, makes it sound very academic, and the first third of it is about transportation, the placement of towns, and it's so deadly dull. But once you get into what the book is about, and what it got him the invitations to the palaces of Europe and to the White House, was this declaration of the intent of the ruling elite to wipe out the middle class in America and elsewhere in the world.
That's extraordinary. And Wayne, I just want to add for our audience, the author you're speaking of is H.G. Wells.
Oh, thank you for mentioning that. H.G. Wells was celebrated from the time of that little book until his death, never repudiated, and yet the words of his writing were, if actually used today, would result in his being expelled from society, certainly the espoused society of the correct left in the United States, because he was expressly saying that the blacks and the browns and the yellows and the red-skinned and the dirty-skinned whites and the Jews all ought to be exterminated. They were the people of the abyss. And by the year 2000, the ruling elite needed to find ways to poison sufficient numbers of people to exterminate them all. That wars had been found so far simply to be inadequate to kill enough people to keep the population thinned out. These were said in very explicit terms, not just in terms of objectives, but the way they were going to do it. One is graduated income tax, a network of privately owned central banks worldwide. Tax-exempt foundations and trusts that would protect the wealth of the ruling elite from any taxation. And how does it protect them when the IRS is there? Because the IRS goes after middle-class groups like the Tea Party, not after the big charitable foundations that belong to the ruling elite. So those who have to deal with mundane things such as audits are those who profess the views of the middle class, the views of capitalism, not the views of the mercantilist ruling cabal. The ruling cabal has names too, the Rothschilds and many others. The names that are historically recorded, I've got in my book. But that is the circumstance that we've been facing the entire 20th century. They went about creating World War I. They went about overthrowing the Tsar in Russia because apparently he told them no to a Rothschild bank. When Woodrow Wilson double-crossed his Democrat Party electorate and broke both of his promises, which was no central bank and no graduated income tax, he broke those promises in his first year in office. Supposedly regretted it later, but he certainly was never able to do anything about it once they were in effect. And our reporting since that time has become completely a monster controlled by the ruling elite. Our controlled media is as propagandistic as any in the world, perhaps the most so, when at the same time Americans are told we're the only ones who are told the truth in our country. That remains the case with our most of our television and so forth. Fortunately, we have these avenues on the alternative media, and I thank you for having me on to talk about them.
It is our complete privilege. Now, sir, what led you to actually write your book, The Fruits of Graft?
I did a paper that described how supply-side economics had basically been John F. Kennedy's approach toward restoring economic growth. He proposed tax cuts, never got them passed because the elitists kept him from passing them while he was alive, but as soon as they killed him, they passed them in his honor, supposedly, and got some economic growth going for Lyndon Johnson. But nevertheless, the rest of the century, until Ronald Reagan was all tax increases again. So it was that kind of writing. I wound up getting hired by Jude Winniski to represent his firm in the Western United States, and did a little writing for them. The more I did, though, it became clearer that I was not able to touch on the subjects of fraud in the markets and fraudulent trading practices, both by the firms and by various small operators and so forth. It's just not done. And of course, when we later had the experience with that fraudulent Wall Street guy Bernie Madoff, the guy who was trying for 8 years to alert the SEC to his frauds, actually described his situation as having to barricade his home at night, afraid that they were going to be assassinated. If the SEC leaked what he was telling them about the fraud of Bernie Madoff, he was actually drummed out of the business in Boston, even though he was president of the Chartered Financial Analysts. He was one of the top people in the technical analysis of markets, and yet he is now, as I understand it, working as an insurance adjuster on claims, because once you try to expose fraud in the markets, you can't work in the financial sector any longer. That is the circumstance of the American market presently. It is entirely mercantilist operated. The SEC was created by Lyndon Johnson, by Franklin Roosevelt and his people to protect the biggest frauds in the market from any prosecution by the law. Yes, they created federal laws, demand of the public, but they then set up the SEC to be political appointees and to have complete discretion as to who would be investigated and who would be prosecuted. This still to this day, and they give slaps on the wrist, such as they gave Goldman Sachs after the tech crash, and since they practically just looked completely the other way during the crash of 2008, both of which I describe in my book in detail as to how they were orchestrated. Both of those crashes were orchestrated. The tech crash with an important assist from the Federal Reserve, secretly done, but knowingly, but I'm not sure anybody else described the way that the Fed set up that crash other than in my book.
Could you nutshell that for us, please?
Yes, between 1996 and 2000, without saying so to the public or giving any indication of it to the public, the Fed began deflating the dollar. In other words, not creating enough money to serve the economic growth that was coming. Now, this was not done by mistake. In fact, my mentor and employer back a few years ago told me, Jude Winniski told me, that he had contacted Greenspan, with whom he was acquainted and had frequent conversations. He had contacted Greenspan, and I think as early as 1997, telling him that the price of gold was rising and that if he didn't watch that, deflation would cause a recession. Now, after that contact, Greenspan broke off communication with him, would not communicate with Winniski. So Winniski, being alarmed by the circumstance as it got worse instead of better, contacted the White House of Clinton and was referred to the Treasury Department, was eventually met with Lawrence Summers, who was the Undersecretary of Treasury at that time, and told him his concerns that deflation was going to wreck the economy. They were already starting to see a sharp drop in the price of oil. People won't believe that the price of oil dropped to something like, let's see, $18 a barrel or something like that in
Oh my.
1998. It was getting severe at that time, and yet Lawrence Summers' response to Winniski in his office was, "We don't do gold. We don't pay any attention to that. It's, you know, the ancient relic." The thing that the price of gold did at that time, it doesn't do it so well now because even it is manipulated now. They learned the way to manipulate it by using these futures contracts that sell paper gold, and they set the price of gold in the market, so-called, based on paper contracts that do not deliver gold. It's a fake price, but it's entirely controlled by them. In any event, the way the crash, then the deflation continued right up to 2000. And during that process of 4 years, spot priced commodities fell like a rock. And so capital moved out of the countries, out of the basic industries, and they invested in what was profitable, which was high tech. Driving with all that capital going into high tech, it drove the prices sky high. And then when that crashed, it was the perfect setup for doing exactly what Wall Street loves to do, which is to sell short, knowing there's no bottom in there. So in the first week in March of the year 2000, they were ready to go with it. All the capital had gone into the high tech, driving the prices way up. The small Asian countries that produce commodities, the basic industries of the U.S. were on their back because their commodity prices were nothing because of the severe deflation. Gold had gone from above $400 an ounce in '96 to it got as low as $252. Now that is a severe, severe deflation. And when that happens, you have to cut your prices. The prices of commodities must be cut on a daily basis or you can't sell the product. That's why those companies went out of business. And then, of course, tech was so high and it had no customers because every other industry was on its back by then. Nobody could buy tech. And so on that first week in March, I'll tell you later how we know it, but I know it now because what we learned in 2007. In 2007, the SEC slapped Goldman Sachs on the wrist, gave them a $7 million fine for, in the first week of March of 2000, letting their platforms be used directly by their hedge fund clients to do their own trading slips. As soon as they did that, those trading firms started marking their short sales as long sales, which allowed them to avoid the uptick rule and to avoid borrowing stock to deliver the stock. So it was naked short selling starting in the first week of March of 2000 and ending in the first week of October of 2002. That's the precise time that the tech crash occurred.
That's extraordinary. So what you're saying is they knew it was coming, so they went short on everything, so they profited.
Yes, the same thing they did in the crash of 1929, set up a different way, executed a different way because they didn't have the high tech. But there is no more profitable time for Wall Street and the mercantilist marauders than the crash. That is the time you make the most money in the least amount of time. Economic growth is a slow, slow process. They watch paint dry, watching the market go up. But for the crash, it goes hundreds, or even today's market, thousands of points overnight. And you can do these crescendos just like they did in the crash of '29. They had a signal rigged then as well. Joseph P. Kennedy, known as one of the principal operators during the 1920s on Wall Street, was described in a magazine article as on October 29th, the last day of the crash, the morning of the last day of the crash, was sitting on top of the world, according to a magazine of the time, because he had been selling short each of the days of the crash and was going to do so again, greatly increasing the fortune he had already created by his operations on Wall Street and otherwise. Those were the kinds of things that are historically unknown to the American people, because historians and economists have refused to tell them these things. I'm quite sure I'm not the first economist who has found these things and recognized their significance. But I can also tell you the precise actions taken by Franklin D. Roosevelt to make and also of Herbert Hoover, to make the Depression happen and to make certain that it was long and deep and destructive and fatal as possible during that period of time. It's not a pretty picture, but it's the truth about what has happened to the American people, and they need to know it in order to understand better what is occurring today.
Absolutely. So it's a complete, as we know, orchestration of the top and of the elite. But you really bring this into focus when you speak about always in the past, hundreds of years ago, for centuries, there was only two classes. There was the ruling class and there were the slaves, period. And what has happened fairly recently that people don't realize, because people always just assume there's three classes: the upper class, the middle class, and the lower class. But this is actually relatively new in the cases of society. And so what they're doing is a purposeful, intentional elimination of the middle class. And that, I think, is probably the most important thing for people to actually realize, that this is being created, orchestrated on purpose.
It is still to this day. And I think this is exactly these are the forces worldwide, globally, that certainly just devastate so many other countries. And I hate to say it, but I believe the United States and our military capabilities have been used as weapons for those people to do these dastardly deeds in many cases. But to give you an idea of the way this has worked over the century, and still certainly is in effect now, during this tremendous battle that has commenced since my book came out. As of 2011, when my book was published, I didn't have the glimpse over the horizon of anybody stepping up the way Donald Trump did. I did have in view that only somebody with their own wealth at a level capable of actually competing with the global elite could possibly win the presidency, because the two parties get their monies, both of them get the monies from the same establishment. They just call one the Republican establishment, one the Democratic establishment.
You brought up the president. Turning our attention to the modern day Federal Reserve and President Trump, he seems to be on the path of changing the relationship between Washington and the Federal Reserve. Most people who are aware of what is happening are wondering whether the president can actually save this situation. From your perspective, what are the options that he has, and how dangerous is the situation right now?
Well, I think the situation is dangerous, but let me tell you, I'm absolutely clear in my mind that the most dangerous time we had was in November of 2016, with the opposition party candidate almost at the point of taking power by hook or crook, either by stealing the elections or by what the polls were saying. I think completely fraudulently again, that she was the hands-down winner, inevitable and so forth. But that is the scary situation, because there's no doubt in my mind, at least I'm pretty much convinced, that they were ready to close the deal on the destruction of the middle class And I think that candidate was intended and eager to be the closer. That is, by our having at the last possible time an independent candidate come in and actually be well enough prepared, as President Kennedy was not during his I mean, he was elected as an establishment president. Clearly, his father was a part of that, and yet, whether his own values, perhaps coming to him from his experience in the military, brought him to a point of being a champion for the people. And in that circumstance, of course, they killed him.
I know this is an incredibly emotional topic for you, that John F. Kennedy was killed, because I know that was our shining opportunity to expose this. He grew up in a family that knew exactly what was happening, and he himself was the opposite of it. His spirit and his attitude was to save America. And so people not knowing what they had felt what they had. They felt his heart was in it, and they were so attached to him. So I know that that is a completely tender topic. But I also know that in President Trump, we've got a second chance, and he knows what happened to Kennedy, and obviously was very good friends with John F. Kennedy Jr., which is another very odd topic. But he knows what he's up against. And even though the American people as a whole, unfortunately, don't see it yet, they will. Speaking one more time about the president, the relationship between the United States and China, these two countries are poised to dominate the next century, and perhaps many to come. The president is in the process of renegotiating our trade deal with China and elsewhere around the world. And Wayne, I want to ask your opinion on something. Could it be actually leading to something bigger for the United States regarding our currency? Because our currency appears to be in trouble in the near future if something is not done. And we are certain that Donald Trump, as fabulous as he is with money, is well aware of this situation. So in his renegotiations, is that his focus? Can you please explain what the president's plan could be in these renegotiations of all of our trade deals?
Well, I think his plan is to go to a sound currency. That meaning one in which the money that we use has actual value, or can be converted to it very expeditiously. We have fiat currency now, completely a tool of the ruling elite, and it is designed to crash. Their crash is when they finally leave everyone else penniless and they have all the wealth and hard assets in their own control. That's the design of the central banks, and certainly it's the design of the Federal Reserve. And so their game plan is to crash the currency. It's a matter, he has been keeping that from happening, I think. And in order to, one reason for keeping it from happening already is that he needs to rebalance our current account in our exports and imports. As he has stated many times, we've had an $800 billion per year deficit. That is, we buy that much more from abroad than we sell abroad. That would mean if we would go to a gold standard presently, we would have to deliver $800 to $850 billion worth of gold every year to other nations, which would leave us penniless, and of course our currency would be worthless. We couldn't issue it any longer. And so in that circumstance, he's using the tariffs and renegotiating the trade agreements in order to get us into a balanced trade arrangement with major countries, certainly including Europe, certainly including China. And of course, when he does that, it's disadvantageous to them, and they squeal about it. But it's very important to do that. And I believe that he has, very likely he has the support of both Russia and China in doing this, as well as other countries who want to go to a sound currency. The BRICS nations and all the nations who've signed on with them want a sound currency because they know the dollar is going to zero when the ruling elite it serves their purposes. To explain that again, the dollar is called a note because it is a promissory note from the Fed to us. It's a promise supposedly from them, although it's not even stated on the dollar any longer. But it supposedly was a promise that they would deliver something of value to the person who holds that note, just as they get something of value by issuing the note to us. The only way we get the note is by delivering our labor or our products or gold or something of the sort to them. So they owe us. The Federal Reserve is a debtor institution that has no possibility of paying the debt that it's owed by issuing, that it incurred by issuing all this currency. So they have many trillions in debt. They have a couple of trillion in assets that probably even those assets go to zero when the dollar goes to zero. And so they have no real assets. They will become a completely illiquid bankrupt institution when the dollar goes to zero, and the people with all of the hard assets, the ruling elite, will be sitting with those assets, and all the rest of the world, including ourselves, will be destitute. The president has the problem of being able to get a current account balance and go to a hard currency, have it ready to go before he ends the Fed. And he wants to do that before the dollar crashes, because as soon as the dollar crashes, economically we're chaotic. And he wants to have the chaos as brief as possible when we make the change from the Fed's fiat currency to the good money that he wants to go to. So that's the reason he's making these trade negotiations, the tariffs, and the various kinds of delays in acting on the Fed. It would not be a good thing to end the Fed right now, although I've said many times in my writings, end the Fed as soon as possible. That's what we want to do, but we have to have a sound trade system to go to a sound currency. And part of that, I believe, is involved in that order that I mentioned before, the executive order that confiscate assets of these cabalists who've been deeply involved in all of this evil. When their assets are available to us, we have a much greater treasury of the United States with which to fund the new dollar. And then we can go to a sound currency and perhaps be free, hopefully once and for all, but it'll have to be defended, an actual capitalist economy for the common people, for the middle class, for the working people, for the productive people. That's what we're after. And the war is still on, but the reports are good. I think we've got progress in the works and on the way, and the people who are on the wrong side are scrambling already, and they're going to have to before this is over.
So we are actually watching something that's highly significant. When he talks about I'm renegotiating these trade deals, there's a method to his madness, and he actually is in a race, isn't he, right now?
Oh, I don't think there's any question. I think I'm convinced, and have been from the beginning, there is very definitely method in what he is doing. The public statements may seem somewhat erratic at times, but it's only because he has to be careful with what is said to the propaganda media. I mean, they're not on they're not even neutral. I mean, neutral would be good, but that's not the case. They are the mercantilist media, as much as Pravda ever was for the Soviet Union. And, that's one reason Russia has been made to be such a so-called enemy. They are the other Christian nation. They have a population that is about the same percentage Christian as the United States does. And they are serious about their Christianity. I was hearing a woman journalist from Denmark just yesterday describing how Christianity is serious, and people are serious about it in terms of the way they conduct their society and themselves in Russia, and don't apologize for it. So I think there's reason to have optimism, and I am optimistic, much more so, I'm happy to say, than at the time my book actually came out, although I was hopeful. It's much easier now to be optimistic.
Yes, indeed. God bless our president. When people realize what he's been doing in the background up against phenomenal
I think we're going to learn a lot more of what he's been doing in the background, and it's going to be terrific. And the people who have been supporting him, that have been keeping him alive, despite what I believe have been numerous assassination attempts, that's what President Kennedy didn't have. He didn't have the pre-preparation and the careful protection that presidents need if they want to have any chance against the cabal, because they are ruthless.
Wayne, this has been an incredible interview. Please tell everyone about your fantastic website. And by the way, everyone should visit it at least once. It is addictive with your articles. Also about your book and how everyone can follow your work.
Well, I call my website classicalcapital.com because I practice classical economic theory and basically use that. The first chapter of my book explains economics from a classical viewpoint, and I say in the preface that if you read this one chapter, you won't be at the mercy of a Keynesian economist again, because the basic principles of classical economic theory are understandable. That's why we have classical capital, and the Fruits of Graft, Great Depressions Then and Now, is available on my website. It was available on Amazon. It's not now because the number of sales increased to the extent that I couldn't get them out fast enough. Then I got a professional dispatcher or fulfillment source, and they were even slower, so they didn't satisfy Amazon, but they're faster now. And so, yes, it's available through my website, classicalcapital.com. It's got a table of contents and so forth. So thank you for asking. And I do think it's information you will not find in any other book. And certainly, for the Great Depression, the tech crash, 2008, people who have been there have said that my explanation of the tech crash is the only one that knows what facts are. And I think 2008 may come closer than anybody else also.
Oh, agreed. Wayne, thank you so much for coming on this show today.
You're very welcome, Michelle. It's an honor to be asked by you. Thank you. Mr.
Wayne Jett, attorney, author, publisher, and profiled in our exclusive report at portfoliowealthglobal.com/Wayne. For the Industry Experts Panel, I'm Michelle Holliday at portfoliowealthglobal.com.
The very word secrecy is repugnant in a free and open society. And we are, as a people, inherently and historically opposed to secret societies, to secret oaths, and to secret proceedings. We decided long ago that the dangers of excessive and unwarranted concealment of pertinent facts far outweighed the dangers which are cited to justify it. Even today, there is little value in opposing the threat of a closed society by imitating its arbitrary restrictions. Even today, There is little value in ensuring the survival of our nation if our traditions do not survive with it. And there is very grave danger that an announced need for increased security will be seized upon by those anxious to expand its meaning to the very limits of official censorship and concealment. That I do not intend to permit to the extent that it's in my control. And no official of my administration, whether his rank is high or low, civilian or military, should interpret my words here tonight as an excuse to censor the news, to stifle dissent, to cover up our mistakes, or to withhold from the press and the public the facts they deserve to know. For we are opposed around the world by a monolithic and ruthless conspiracy that relies primarily on covert means for expanding its sphere of influence, on infiltration instead of invasion, on subversion instead of elections, on intimidation instead of free choice, on guerrillas by night instead of armies by day. It is a system which has conscripted vast human and material resources into the building of a tightly knit, highly efficient machine that combines military, diplomatic, intelligence, economic, scientific, and political operations. Its preparations are concealed, not published. Its mistakes are buried, not headlined. Its dissenters are silenced, not praised. No expenditure is questioned, no rumor is printed, no secret is revealed. I am not asking your newspapers to support an administration, but I am asking your help in the tremendous task of informing and alerting the American people.